Giuseppe Klonopin Rowling. A person with many bad qualities, but by far her worst is her inability to write a coherent, magical world. In 2018, Rowling responded to a tweet calling her out for devising an utterly stupid game called Quidditch. In Quidditch, a bunch of people fly around on brooms, getting points by throwing balls into a goal. Oh, it's a sport ball. I get it. I love a sport ball. Sport ball is my favorite. The broken part is that there's this little guy called the Golden Snitch that darts all over the stadium. Whichever team catches the Golden Snitch first gets 150 points, and then the game ends. They don't win the game just ends. So, if you're 160 points behind and your team catches the Golden Snitch, you lose. There are several times throughout the books where a team that is losing the game by more than 150 points will just catch the Golden Snitch to, lose with honor. Like teenage jocks often do. In response to someone telling her that this makes no sense, Giuseppe responded,
"It makes total sense. There's glamour in chasing an elusive lucky break, but teamwork and persistence can still win the day. Everyone's vulnerable to blows of fate and obstructive people, and success means rising above them. Quidditch is the human condition."
You're welcome.
Huh? No. They weren't saying that the game doesn't make symbolic sense. They were saying it makes no practical sense. And that means that all of the Quidditch matches in the books feel like a boring waste of time. I love sport ball, particularly the way it reflects the metaphysics of the incarnate soul. Am I right, fellas? Joanna Cabana Rowling is both the creator of Quidditch and also doesn't understand how Quidditch affects her story. All this to say, I am a die-hard death of the author extremist. Not only does a writer's intention not matter once a story is released to the public, a writer's intentions can straight up be wrong when they undermine the utility of the story's literary devices. There are times when a writer deserves the utmost devotion to sincere analysis on the part of their readers, and other times when they deserve an inquisition. Sometimes you find yourself asking if a story has successfully convinced you to follow in its emotional logic, or if there is a troubling dissonance that keeps you at arm's length. Today, we're going to ask which of these paths a proper analysis of the character of Azula ought to take, and how an in-depth reading of the character of Zuko can inform that analysis. They naturally demand comparison. Two siblings of opposite temperaments, one of whom rises against great odds, and the other a paragon of royalty brought down to her lowest low. We're being invited to compare the two, and we're tempted to investigate where their paths diverged. It's been almost 20 years since Zuko's pretty face made its grand debut to the world, and he's still spoken of throughout the fandom with the utmost reverence. We automatically compare any redemption arc to his, as if he was the golden standard. But not only is he a compelling character, people just seem to like him. He has to fight to be good, fight both himself and the world he was brought up in. And I think that because his trials are so insurmountable, the temptations so high and the right path so punishing, we come to trust his goodness absolutely. By Crossroads of Destiny, we're given a glimpse at just how good-hearted Zuko can be. And that's why it really hurts when we see that he hasn't actually been redeemed yet. By the finale, we have seen him successfully put in the work to prove that this transformation has stuck. And that's why, when we're trying to get our anime repulsed friends into Avatar, we tell them about Zuko. You're closer now, because the sun was out, and it made everything bad. It's still making things bad. God damn it. On the other hand, Azula can be sort of difficult to talk about, because there's just such a deep and cutting tragedy to her. A child, younger than most of our main cast, indoctrinated and held to unreasonable standards throughout her short life. Yet, also a dangerous political agent. If we mention her at all, it's to talk about what a ruthless, entertaining villain she is. Azula seems almost entirely irredeemable, with just a handful of moments alluding to the possibility that she has any capacity for goodness. She interacts kindly with her friends and brother approximately twice throughout the run of the show. She's given plenty of time to show some sort of humanity, she just doesn't. But in the final hour of the story, we're shown that, in fact, she was a human being the whole time. Things in her life actually have affected her. And she has goals beyond the here and now that we have not yet been invited to consider. And we're given our first and only glimpse into where she went wrong. This is the only indication we are ever given to suggest that she could have turned out differently. And it's, the finale. We are going to talk about who Azula is, but first I'd like to talk about what Azula isn't. This is important groundwork, so stick with me. I am often frustrated by a common fan interpretation of Azula as, for lack of a better term, psychopathic. We will come back to that word. You can hold me to that. The idea seems to be that Azula is so interested in power because of the pure hedonistic pleasure of it, and she doesn't care who she has to screw over to get it, or may even enjoy that aspect. What seems to follow from this are implications that she lacks some kind of basic human empathy, has only shallow emotions, no forward vision, no complex humanity. I hate this, and I also happen to think it isn't supported by the text. Let's start with why I hate it, because I really hate it. It feels like a way of stripping her character of any meaningful agency. It makes her extremely boring in hindsight, which is the opposite of what a well-written character should do. What's more, for reasons that I will get into, the idea that she is one-dimensionally cruel and entirely self-serving is deeply problematic to me, mostly for story reasons, but also for society reasons. Azula and the men who made her, my magnum opus. Why does everything have to be so political nowadays? It's just a cartoon, Snowflake. Go back to 2014 where you belong. I just finished a series on the antagonists of The Dragon Prince. And while developing my ideas, I read a lot of takes about why the villains I was interested in writing about were just so goddamn evil. This was especially true for Erebos, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the big bad of the show. Analyses of the character tended to focus on interpreting morally neutral or ambiguous actions as callously or destructively intended. For example, a villain can't simply be hurt because they feel betrayed. They must be angry because their authoritarian control over others was challenged. It often seemed like viewers took the most superficial reading of a character and recast any little bit of evidence in a needlessly dim light. Azula apologizes to Ty Lee for making her cry. That must have been a manipulative chess gambit in her plot to maintain loyalty. It felt a bit like the way some religious people cherry-pick quotes from their given holy text and spin them to convey the morals they already believe in. Like, why even read the text at that point? Might as well just go with the morals you already had. If you really don't care about characters, trying to get into their minds, understanding their motivations, that's totally valid. But maybe character analysis just isn't for you. I like talking about this shit, and that's why I'm doing it. As for my society reasons, strap in. In 1888, German psychiatrist J.L.A. Koch coined the term psychopathich, from which we get the English term psychopath. Psychopathich means suffering soul, and as you can imagine, that was sufficiently vague enough to cover lack of motivation, self-harm tendencies, depression, basically mental illness? Today, the term is similarly vague enough to be entirely useless. There well may be such thing as a psychopath, but the fact that it was coined 136 years ago and the term is still not in the DSM, nor is its similarly vague cousin the sociopath, we should consider the idea of a psychopath to be an hypothesis. And personally, I'm inclined to regard it as a myth. The main point that seems to unify the alleged components of a psychopath, lack of empathy, shallow affect, lack of motivation, impulsivity, seems to be a general sense that such people can't feel things that deeply. Shallow affect, or a perceived incongruence between what a person is expressing and the way in which they are expressing it, prompts the interviewer, if there even is a live interviewer, to assume that whatever the alleged psychopath says about their experience might not be true. If a psychopath says they have empathy, but their affect seems shallow, you might just not believe them. They have a deficit in profundity, which keeps them from experiencing important emotions like empathy and motivation. Personally, I say that this designation, as well as its DSM-recognized associate antisocial personality disorder, is a way of further dehumanizing people in the carceral system. No one has to feel bad about treating them with a complete lack of care and compassion while in a system that is already victimizing them. Further, personality disorders are determined by behavior. No one looks into the heart of a psychopath and sees that there's no empathy there. They judge that there is a lack of empathy based on behavior, and behaviors can be misconstrued. Among some, there is a vague sense that a sociopath is made while a psychopath is born, but the primary research in the subject has to do with how such people interact with the criminal justice system, not how their minds work in a vacuum. But I won't tell you what to believe. There are Ted Bundys in the world, after all. People for whom there truly seems no explanation other than a biological lack of empathy. But there's another reason we shouldn't haphazardly apply this idea to Azula. It has more to do with anachronism and the way we conceptualize the human mind differently based on time period and culture. Psychopathy, if it exists, would necessarily be a byproduct of the hyper-specific cultures that recognize it, even in the profoundly flawed DSM. We are reminded that disorders can only exist where symptoms are not better understood as normative for the individual's developmental stage of sociocultural environment. There are settings in which a lack of empathy would make one an exemplar amongst their peers, and in such environments, it would be odd to attribute this callousness to a biological defect or something innate to one's personhood. Rather, it would seem as though that person had developed appropriately based on the soil in which they were planted. You have to remember that Zuko's dreams of a society built on love and peace are extremely modern, and all of the individual steps he takes to fully glimpse this vision of the world pull him further away from the base assumptions at the heart of his upbringing. For instance, some people like to argue about whether Ozai ever loved his children, but if you're reading about the dynamics of fatherhood and rulership from a historical perspective, you can see that familial love isn't the same essential entity throughout cultures and periods. We don't know if Ozai ever had a paternal drive. He had children to continue his bloodline and avoid violent complications with succession after his death. That doesn't mean he hated his children, or even that he didn't feel emotionally affected by them. It just means that having children is something a prince needs to do. Look at the moment Zuko confronts Ozai about the cruelty of challenging a child to a duel.
How can you possibly justify a duel with a child?
It was to teach you respect.
The very notion that such an act can be cruel is entirely alien to Ozai. He genuinely believes he did the right thing. The fact that Zuko is traumatized by this event is the notable thing, not the fact that Ozai feels justified in his actions. Trauma only has the clinical significance that it does today because the effects of trauma are generally no longer helpful. It is in some ways a vestigial part of the human mind. We no longer need to live that way. In most places, we can emotionally afford to love our children and parents, and we get to pretend that this is a fundamental and essential part of our existence. But history bears out that that's not necessarily true. Zuko isn't good in comparison to Azula, who is bad. Rather, Zuko is morally exceptional in comparison to Azula, who is morally normal. I'm like retreating from the sun. Get away, son, you son of a bitch. You son of a bitch. Son of a bitch. Son. It's a homophone. I bring this up not just to show you that the psychopath reading of Azula is unrealistic. I can see it now. A comment saying, "Genius realizes cartoons are not real life. Groundbreaking." That's not the point. But thank you for engaging. You can also share this video with all your edgy big boy friends. I'm sure they would love to lol at it too, you know? You should actually just subscribe so you will know when I make another shitty take. Come on, I just made your life so much better with that suggestion. The point is that Azula being framed as a psychopath inherently flattens her character. It both dehumanizes her and disempowers us from understanding the society in which she was raised. It removes any ability to understand the world through her behavior because psychopaths aren't made, they're born. It takes away what her goals and motivations might say about the culture of her nation, because a psychopath wouldn't really care about a higher purpose. It even defangs the impact of her viciousness. If a psychopath lacks the motivation to plan for something, struggles with impulsivity, how can we possibly attribute Azula's successes to her brilliance, her formidability? It's simply an accident of the stars that she became as successful as she is. We don't see truth reflected in the psychopath, because the myth of the psychopath is a black hole where all thoughts of truth go to die. There is no human being in there, only a shallow affect. But, most importantly, it blunts the impact of the most dramatic arc in the story. It glosses over the fact that Zuko does something incredible by self-realizing in a way that is distinct from the culture in which he is born. Luckily, as I said, I don't believe that this reading is backed up by the text. So, why? Well, the biggest piece of evidence that I can see is that she certainly doesn't lack for motivation. A more psychopathic character would be portrayed as more of a bloodsucker. A more psychopathic Azula would probably use her power to loaf around, achieve nothing, and not really contribute to her family's success. But Azula is marked by her intense drive for success. Actually, it's more than success, isn't it?
Almost perfect. One hair out of place.
Almost isn't good enough.
Perfection. And that perfection is immediately contrasted with her fear of being imperfect. Wow. I have a lot of power. She's extremely confident and competent, a prodigy, but it is not just by providence that she is so talented and brilliant. It's the drive, and the drive away from something almost isn't good enough. In Azula's penultimate appearance before the finale, she is shocked and angered when her friends turn against her. This clearly shakes her, but not to the extent that she is out of control. She is still well within her limits of normal behavior. Some genuine emotion is present, but we can't quite put our finger on it. The finale rips this ambiguity apart. It's filled with fantastic Azula moments, and one of the most important lines of her characterization happens during a conversation with her father.
You can't treat me like this! You can't treat me like Zuko!
Wow, where did that come from? This is Azula in fear, real fear. The kind of fear that would cause her to snap at her father. She's terrified of being treated like Zuko. By the way, I'm borrowing this observation from a Tumblr user called Cobra Diamond. They've written a ton of essays on Azula that I really enjoyed, so I will be referencing them a lot. Cobra Diamond goes on to ask what being treated like Zuko means. And it seems like there are countless ways to answer that question while piling up on the anxieties Azula is expressing in this moment. Zuko is undeserving of attention, a weak liability to the family, the discardable one worth more dead than alive, a bleeding heart who lacks loyalty. Zuko has no worth in the Fire Nation in its current iteration. The fact that Zuko and Azula grew up to be so different can be attributed to their respective aptitudes with the skills of being a future Fire Lord. Azula was shrewd and regal and endlessly talented right from the beginning. She was therefore held up as her father's pride and joy. This drove her to be smarter, harder, and more worthy of the throne than Zuko. Zuko was therefore pushed to the side, so he often fell into the arms of his loving mother. Maybe he was also just a more sensitive child. We'll never know how much of who he is can be chalked up to nurture versus nature. But what's evident is that each was favored by one of their parents, and each parent went on to cultivate their own values in their favorite. Thus, Azula fits right in with her father, the fittest of his specimen, one who can screw over his own grieving brother, kill his own son, and conspire against his own father. Even assuming Iroh would have been a bloodthirsty and oppressive Fire Lord, Ozai was just better at it than him. Zuko, on the other hand, finds a home with the outsiders, first with his down-to-earth mother, and then with his disillusioned uncle. Finally, when Zuko is burned, humiliated, and exiled, Azula sees how this conflict between mom and dad shakes out. Ozai has the power, Ursa doesn't. Ursa loses the battle over her children's minds to a stronger and more ruthless opponent. Azula is given a very strong demonstration that her father's qualities will win out over her mother's. And that's done by showering her with adoration and respect and branding Zuko a pariah. And that's telling, isn't it? It isn't the risk-taking, callous Azula that finds herself as the outsider. It's the sensitive Zuko, who respects his father and stands up for patriotic soldiers. Are we really to assume that the Fire Nation is filled with unfeeling monsters who love destructive personalities? No, right? They're just people. They can all be normal, loving, empathetic human beings. So, how does someone like Azula become the prized gem of a nation of normal people? If she's in the inner circle and Zuko is the outcast, it would seem natural to assume that it wasn't Azula who is biologically bereft of goodness, but that there are standards and values in this society that contributed to the way Azula grew up. As we watch Azula being praised for her ruthlessness, it seems to me that we are not just being invited to understand Azula's mind, or even her family life. Rather, this sounds like an opportunity to understand her country. Perhaps, as a princess, and one who clearly aspires to great things, the nation is being personified through her. Maybe we can't understand Azula in a vacuum, and the qualities she prizes are also prized by her culture. Cobra Diamond wrote a fantastic piece on the cultural context in which Azula would have been raised. The Fire Nation is pretty clearly comparable to Japan, and Cobra Diamond expands upon just how deep this comparison runs. They speculate that, like Japan, the Fire Nation used to be a brutal congregation of warring fiefdoms trying to conquer the whole archipelago. Unlike in Japan, these warring fiefdoms could also shoot fire out of their hands. Not great for advancing a society, is it? So, at some point, one person conquered all the Fire Islands, enforced a unified government, and established a dynasty. The other three nations are all some flavor of decentralized, but the Fire Nation needed to be ruled with an iron fist, or the violence would continue to destroy their land and societal achievements every 15 years or so. To do this, the first Fire Lord immediately locked down the entire nation, suppressed any rival factions, and ensured that the main source of power, firebenders, were firmly under their control. If the central ruler of the nation wasn't a complete autocrat, they risked having to defend their claim in battle. It may seem cruel to execute anyone suspected of dissidence, or punish children for being weak, or conspire against your own family, but in the mind of such a ruler, these individual acts of violence are preferable to constant civil war. And this is the environment Azula grew up in. In fact, it's also the environment Sozin grew up in. Think about him for a moment. The supposed father of Fire Nation expansionism is sitting in the center of a dynasty that has transformed a dangerous, war-stricken land through enforced unity. As we see in The Avatar and the Fire Lord, Sozin's reign saw unprecedented peace and prosperity. Much like Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, baked into all layers of society was the underlying assumption that controlling potential enemies with strength and fear was the way to keep that security. Of course, eventually this manifested into an expansionist view. Sozin's plans of conquest were justified through talks of spreading prosperity, and this wasn't totally a euphemism. It was almost certainly a genuine thought, expressing the underlying mechanics of a conquest through an ideological filter. Suppression and peace are synonyms. It's not that Sozin was obscuring bad intentions with good ones, it's that conquest is a fundamentally good thing in his mind. Azula is of the generation with the most refined commitment to this assumption. Azula believes in what she refers to as the divine right to rule.
I can see your whole history in your eyes. You were born with nothing. So you've had to struggle and connive and claw your way to power. But true power, the divine right to rule, is something you're born with.
Which students of history will probably associate more with the Japanese emperor than with the shogun. You could even imagine that Azula's generation in the dynasty became even more perfect than its real-world reference ever became. The divine right to rule is something you're born with. I think this line alone provides a reason that you can't really pigeonhole Azula into contemporary understandings of antisocial behavior. Why is this the place her mind goes after achieving victory over her opponent? She doesn't brag about her brilliance or the many rewards that this success will bring her. It's this bitter utterance of the natural order of things and the way that it's been profaned. He's a commoner. He has no divine right to rule. He has almost affronted heaven with his actions. Why exactly does Azula climb so high? It seems almost obvious now. Power and domination are virtues in and of themselves. Her unique brand of intimidation, that ability to allow a calm smile to speak her capacity for brutality for her, it's a prized tool. As the princess of the nation, she is trying to exemplify the characteristics that it respects. To be like Zuko is to fail in her charge. When Ozai becomes a father, and when he becomes the Fire Lord, there is no underlying sadistic desire being realized through these accomplishments. They were accomplishments in the first place because they contribute to the perceived health of the nation, and this desire is inherently social, not antisocial. Likewise, as Azula is caught up in her downward spiral, she tells Lo and Lee that she will be the greatest leader in Fire Nation history.
But I will be the greatest leader in Fire Nation history.
This may be narcissistic, but again, it's not antisocial. It's hypersocial. She wants to go down in the books as someone who made her nation stronger and bigger and richer. At the very end of the show, Zuko declares that his dream for the Fire Nation is that it begins a new era of peace and love. Of course, this is completely contradictory to the values this nation has been taught. Peace and love are more dangerous than fear. They require trust and sacrifice. But because of the journey he's been on, he knows the real cost of the kind of prosperity that Sozin's Way offers. It may be less violent in terms of blood loss, but the violence lies in the negative spaces. The threat of punishment is latent violence. If you're quiet in the council meeting, you'll be okay. But if you speak a dissenting opinion, violence can be unleashed upon you. As a cog in the overwhelming war machine that is his nation, he knows that the violence is there. Azula does not. Not only is she exceptionally young, but she has only been shown through actions and rhetoric that her value is in her strength, and that the power of her position is fundamentally righteous. So yeah, Azula is a complex person with hidden depths. Her fears and desires are a natural manifestation of the kind of role she was taught to occupy. And so, we must look at the way her story ends. Azula finds herself disheveled, dissociated, and in uncontrollable tears. She's restrained and alone, abandoned by her father, the ultimate endower of worth in her life. And unlike her father, who concludes his final scene coherent and lucid, she's experienced an agonizing period of paranoia and psychosis. Disempowered, alone, and unloved, I can't help but see her as a victim in these final moments. So, what do we make of this? It's an ending so cold and bleak. We might assume it ought to be saved for the big bad. Even Jet was given a heroic moment in his final scene. Much virtual ink has been spilled trying to understand what a prospective Season 4 of ATLA might look like. And one of the things people agree would be fascinating to watch is an Azula redemption arc. And indeed, it seems that in a fair world, a world Zuko seems interested in building, Azula would grow into the kind of person who could appreciate this new method of social organization. After all, she's only 14. Iroh was much older than her and had much more blood on his hands by the time he began to think about his worldview. Iroh's line about Azula in Bitter Work has become iconic. She's crazy and she needs to go down. And yes, he had just been shot in the heart by her. I get it. I'd probably want to kill her too. But, come on. Why did Iroh have to say this? Once Iroh says something, 99% of the fandom takes it as pure fact. What's more, the comics do a horrible job of honoring any semblance of humanity the finale gave her. Her hallucination of her mother, which happens in one tiny little scene, is blown up to overtake her entire presence on the page. It seems both Iroh and Bryke have no interest in exploring her humanity and offering her a way forward. Sometimes, in retrospect, a good story can appear to be almost a naturally occurring event. The writer has little grasp on what they've made and how they've achieved it. it's hard to discount Azula's arc as entirely a mistake. It's a hell of a lot more interesting than Quidditch. Maybe Azula is forever destined to be a victim of her time and place. It was almost a cruel accident of fate that she just so happened to exemplify a culture that was in the process of falling just as she came into maturity. I, for one, would like to believe that Azula's goals and moral code changed as she got older. Maybe this moment of suffering will enrich her understanding of the world, the way Zuko's fight with Ozai did for him. And that's what I choose to take away from this story. Honestly, I think it's just as good as what the writers came up with. This video is brought to you by me. You're welcome. I think about stories a lot. Almost constantly. I'm not sure where I am right now. Point is, if you're writing a story and you need some help, you can hire me. I consult on screenplays, write serialized fiction, and yes, I write scripts for YouTube professionally. That's right, you're looking at a pro. Don't check my sub count. You can go to my website to check out my portfolio, read my reviews, look at my prices, and reach out for a chat about how I can help with your project.